Millionaire shocked while collecting rent. Finds exhausted black girl sewing by candlelight. A locked apartment. A child with bandaged fingers and quiet dignity. A man with everything except clarity. When real estate tycoon Richard Coleman knocks on the door of a rundown property to evict a tenant, he finds instead a 10-year-old girl with a sewing machine, a secret, and a question that changes everything. Are you the man who owns the house? What begins as an errand turns into a reckoning, one that threatens Richard's empire, uncovers decades of lies, and introduces him to the one person who might redeem it all, the daughter he never knew he had. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. Richard Coleman stood in front of the battered brown door, 4th floor, end of the hall. He'd knocked twice already, each time harder than the last. No answer. The building smelled of dust and boiled cabbage, the kind of place he usually sent assistants to. But this time, something told him to see it himself. The door finally creaked open, just a crack. Through the gap appeared a single eye, then the door opened wider. A girl stood there. No taller than the doorknob, maybe 10, maybe younger. It was hard to tell. Her skin was dark, her hair pulled back in a messy braid, and her fingers wrapped in strips of white gauze. She held a needle in one hand, a sliver of pink fabric in the other. Behind her, a sewing machine sat crooked on a dining chair. "My mama's sleeping," she said quietly. "Are you the man who owns the house?" Richard stared. His brain clicked into old habits. Late rent, Unit C4, leaseholder, Elaine Williams. 3 months past due. "You're alone?" he asked, glancing inside. A dim hallway, the faint sound of a radio in another room. The girl stepped aside. "I can help you if you need something." He walked in without meaning to. The place was small. Kitchen, living room, 1 bedroom behind a torn curtain. The fabric she'd been sewing looked like part of a child's backpack. On the table, 2 slices of bread, no crusts, and a mug of something cold. Richard's voice came out awkward. "Where's your father?" "Never had one," she said, sitting back down at the sewing machine. "It's just me and Mama. She works at the cleaners, but her chest got bad again. I think it's the bleach." He didn't know what to do with his hands. He usually stood in these rooms with lawyers or a clipboard, but now there was no buffer. Only the girl. She lifted the presser foot with her bandaged fingers and kept sewing. "You're hurt," he said. "Thread slipped," she replied. "Happens." Her tone was calm. She wasn't embarrassed, wasn't asking for anything. She was managing. "You know you owe rent?" She nodded. "Mama says we're going to pay it as soon as she goes back to work. We always do." "And if she doesn't?" She looked up then, right at him. "Then maybe you'll take the sewing machine instead." He had no answer to that. Later, in the elevator, Richard found himself checking his palm. He'd reached out to shake her hand, out of instinct. Her name was Zoe. Her fingers, though wrapped, had gripped his firmly. He couldn't stop thinking about it. She'd said, "Nice to meet you, Mr. Coleman." Not like a child, like someone used to handling things. He didn't know why, but he'd paused before the elevator door shut. And in that moment, she'd run to the 5th floor window and waved, small bandaged hand, waving through broken glass. He didn't sleep well that night. The image kept returning. The sewing machine, the cracked mug, the quiet girl. Something about it had scratched at him in a place he didn't know existed anymore. The next morning, his assistant delivered eviction paperwork. He signed it. But something didn't feel right. 2 days later, his phone rang. A voice on the other end. "Are you Mr. Coleman? You've been listed as an emergency contact for a Ms. Elaine Williams. She's in intensive care. Unconscious. Is there a legal guardian for the child?" He didn't answer right away. The nurse added, "The child insisted, said you were the only adult she could trust." Richard had never stepped foot inside a public hospital since his college days. Private clinics, executive wings, concierge medicine, those were more his world now. But as he pushed open the worn glass doors of St. Matthew's Medical Center, the smell of disinfectant and overused HVAC filters hit him like a childhood memory he couldn't place. A woman in pale scrubs met him near the nurse's station. "You're Mr. Coleman?" He nodded. "She's in ICU. We've stabilized her for now. Pulmonary edema, possibly worsened by exposure to cleaning chemicals. Your contact information was written on a sticky note in her daughter's backpack." She handed him a clear plastic bag with personal items inside. A cell phone with a shattered screen, a wallet, a sheet of paper with scrawled handwriting. "If something happens, call Mr. Coleman. He owns the building." That was all it said. The nurse added, "The girl's in the family waiting room. She won't leave." Richard turned toward the hallway. He saw her before she saw him. Zoe sat cross-legged on a plastic chair, hugging her backpack. Her eyes looked too dry, like she'd passed the point of crying. She was wearing the same oversized sweater, now with a faint stain near the collar. He approached slowly. She looked up. "You came." He didn't know what to say. "I got the call." She was coughing a lot. Then she couldn't breathe. "I ran to the bodega. Mr. Ravi has a phone. I used it. The ambulance came fast." "You did the right thing," he said. "I knew you'd come." There wasn't an ounce of doubt in her voice. Not hope, certainty. He sat beside her. "The doctors say she's stable, that's good." Zoe nodded but didn't respond. She stared ahead, as if watching something only she could see. After a while, she spoke again. "They want to know who I'm supposed to stay with." Richard shifted. "Do you have any family?" She shook her head. "Mama didn't like talking about people, just said it was us against the world." He cleared his throat. "And why did you put my name?" "You're the only grown-up I know with a car." She turned to him. "And you didn't look away when I talked. Most do." He blinked. Of all the reasons, that one landed hardest. They sat in silence for several minutes. Nurses passed, machines beeped behind closed doors. Eventually, a woman with a clipboard approached. "Mr. Coleman, can I speak with you privately?" He followed her into a side office. "Mr. Coleman," she began gently, "since you were named as a contact, we're obligated to ask, are you willing to assume temporary custody of the child?" "Custody?" "Yes, until her mother regains consciousness. A minor can't be left without supervision. Otherwise, we'll have to notify family services." Richard hesitated. I don't have children. I run a business." The woman smiled tightly. "So do a lot of people. But this isn't permanent. It's just now." He looked down at the papers in her hands. She added, "Honestly, she's unusually self-sufficient for her age, but we can't leave a 10-year-old girl in a waiting room with a granola bar." He stared out the window. Outside, rain had begun tapping on the glass. By evening, Zoe was sitting in the passenger seat of Richard's sleek black sedan, clutching her backpack like a life preserver. The penthouse was too clean. It always was. Zoe's wide eyes scanned the marble floors, the glass walls, the furniture that looked more like sculpture than anything you'd sit on. "Do I take my shoes off?" He blinked. "You can if you want." She set them neatly beside the door, then stood still, unsure where to go. He showed her the guest room. She walked in slowly, touched the edge of the bed, then opened her backpack. The sewing kit came out first. "You sew every day?" he asked. "Almost. It helps me think." "You're good at it." She gave a tiny shrug. "Mama taught me. She used to work at a place that made uniforms. Said sewing's like solving puzzles with string." Richard watched her arrange her spools like sacred objects. A tiny needlebook rested on top, worn, handmade, stitched with the initials EW. "She said she used to know your company," Zoe added suddenly. "My company?" "Yeah. She worked for a man named Coleman, long time ago." He stiffened. "My father ran a factory in the 90s, a uniform plant. He sold it off years before I took over." Zoe didn't look at him. She opened a zippered pouch. "Mama said the factory promised people shares in the business, said one day they'd get something back. But the promise vanished. People stopped asking." Richard felt something shift in his chest. "I didn't know. She didn't want me to tell anyone. Said people don't like stories that sound like truth." He left her to unpack and walked to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, but didn't drink it. For the first time in years, the walls of his home felt too thin. The next morning, his phone rang. It was Victoria Reynolds, director of the company board. "You missed today's strategy call," she said flatly. "I had a situation. I heard, a girl, from one of your units. It's temporary." "Richard, are you thinking clearly? This could raise liability questions. If something happens..." "She has no one, Victoria. You run a holdings company, not a foster home." He didn't answer. She added, "This isn't the image we want. You need to resolve this quickly, or the board will." He ended the call without a word, then turned to see Zoe standing quietly in the doorway, holding her sewing kit. Zoe was not the kind of child who rummaged or wandered. But 3 days into her stay at Richard's penthouse, he noticed something unusual. A stack of old papers, neatly arranged on the coffee table. Not his papers. Older. Yellowed at the edges. Beside them, a folded newspaper, dated April 1994. He found her in the study, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a notepad open in front of her. "These were in Mama's suitcase," she said before he could ask. "I brought them when we left the apartment." He sat on the edge of the armchair. "What are they?" "Proof," she said simply. He picked up the top sheet, a photocopy of an employment contract, company letterhead, Coleman Uniform and Textile Inc., the name below the header, Elaine Williams, seamstress, and underlined at the bottom in faded ink. "Eligible for Employee Equity Share Program, as of July 1st, 1994. "That's my father's signature," Richard murmured. Zoe nodded. "Mama said they promised part of the company to the black workers, like a reward for loyalty, but it never happened." He flipped through the rest. Photocopies of group letters, pay stubs, even a photograph. A row of women in uniform standing outside the factory gates. Elaine was in the center, arms folded, eyes forward. "She kept all of this?" he asked. Zoe looked up. "Mama said if you keep something long enough, it becomes heavier. Not just paper. History." He sat back, silent. Then she said the thing that hit hardest. She didn't keep it for herself. She kept it in case someone else wanted to remember. That night, Richard found himself in the storage room of his office tower, digging through boxes no one had touched in years. Contracts, balance sheets, dusty filing cabinets from the Coleman uniform days. The factory had been sold before the digital transition. Much of its history remained on paper. He found the master file for the equity program. There it was again. Elaine Williams, employee number 419. Next to her name, equity status confirmed, pending execution. But beside it, stapled over the original, a second sheet, a newer form. Signed not by his father, but by someone else, Victoria Reynolds. He stared at the signature. The form had a typed note. Equity eligibility revoked due to contractual irregularities. No financial liability to be acknowledged. The date, August 3rd, 1994. 2 days after his father was hospitalized for a stroke. Richard called Zoe into his office at home the next day. She brought her folder, carefully organized. "You said your mom used to work with sewing machines?" he asked. "Yes, since she was 16. "Did she keep track of others from the factory?" Zoe nodded. "She wrote down names. I have them here." She laid out a folded notebook. Dozens of names, phone numbers, even birthdays. Richard scanned it slowly. "Do you mind if I speak to some of them?" Zoe paused. "Only if you listen." He nodded. The next 48 hours became a storm. He visited 2 women still living in the Bronx. Former seamstresses now retired, surviving on pensions and scraps. Both remembered the same thing. A promise made, then broken. Neither had ever received documentation of the revocation. Some had been told they never qualified. Others, that the company went bankrupt before the shares could be distributed. None of it was true. One woman, Clarice, still had her original contract. Her copy bore the same language as Elaine's, but her equity line had been crossed out in pen. No initials, no explanation. "I remember Victoria," Clarice said. "She came down from corporate, smiled, told us we'd be taken care of, then stopped answering our letters." Richard asked, "Why didn't you pursue legal action?" Clarice looked at him without blinking. "Against who? The people with all the money? All the lawyers?" He returned home that night to find Zoe asleep on the couch, a pincushion resting on her wrist like a bracelet. Her sewing kit sat open beside her. Inside, tucked behind the velvet lining, he noticed a small square envelope. He almost didn't open it, but curiosity or guilt got the better of him. Inside, a handwritten letter, folded in 3. "To whoever finds this, I kept quiet because I was tired. But tired doesn't make it right. I was promised something. So were many others. We believed it. Maybe we were foolish, but we believed. If you're reading this, I hope you're braver than I was. E.W." He folded the letter back and sat in silence. The next morning, he instructed his legal team to gather every contract ever signed under the equity program. When they asked why, he simply said, "I need to know what was stolen and from whom." They didn't ask again. By the end of the week, Richard had assembled a dossier. Original agreements, employee rosters, internal memos, and a trail of emails from Victoria's early days at the company. They revealed the truth plainly. Victoria had deliberately voided the program, altered records, and buried the evidence under non-disclosure agreements and performance reviews that unfairly targeted Black employees. And all of it had occurred while Richard was in boarding school, his father incapacitated, and Victoria rising through the ranks as stabilizing leadership. When Richard confronted her, she didn't deny it. "You think it's corruption," she said coldly. "I call it protecting the company. Those programs would have bankrupted us. You're only digging now because of that child." He didn't respond, just looked at her for a long moment and said, "You'll answer to the board." The morning of the board meeting, the sky over Midtown was white and overcast, like a canvas waiting for something to stain it. Richard stood in front of the tall mirror in his dressing room, straightening his tie. He didn't usually care much about small details, but today he noticed everything. A loose thread at his cuff, the faint tremor in his hand, the quiet ticking of the watch on his wrist. In the living room, Zoe was braiding her hair. "You nervous?" she asked without looking up. "A little," he admitted. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a thumb drive, wrapped in a piece of fabric with frayed edges. "The documents Mama saved. I scanned everything you didn't already have." "You did that?" She nodded. "You said the truth matters, so I wanted to be sure it wouldn't disappear again." He didn't speak, just reached for the drive and closed his fingers around it. Outside, the car was already waiting. The boardroom on the 44th floor was as cold as ever. A long glass table, floor-to-ceiling windows, a wall of awards and framed partnerships. 11 directors sat in their seats, each of them older, polished, calculating. Victoria Reynolds sat at the head of the table, flawless in a navy suit. Her mouth tightened when she saw Richard enter. "This is highly irregular," she said, as he plugged in his laptop. "You're not scheduled on today's agenda." "I'm invoking Executive Clause 8, he replied calmly. "The board must hear material findings related to company liability and legacy exposure." She narrowed her eyes. "And what exactly are we being exposed to?" He tapped the projector remote. The screen behind him flickered on. Slide 1. A scanned contract. Elaine Williams. Seamstress. Dated July 1994. Slide 2. Company memo, authored by Victoria Reynolds, revoking equity programs due to internal restructuring. Slide 3. Email correspondence between Victoria and General Counsel, dated 6 weeks later. If we reclassify the roles and avoid paper trails, they'll have no legal recourse. These women don't even have email addresses. A quiet ripple passed across the table. Richard continued. Slide 4. A photograph of factory workers in uniform, including Elaine. Slide 5. Testimonies from former employees. Slide 6. Zoe's scanned ledger. Handwritten names of over 40 individuals who received the same promise, and never a cent. "You forged revocation memos," Richard said calmly. "You covered it up for decades." Victoria's voice was icy. "This is a sentimental crusade, not a legal one. Those records were voided when the factory was sold." "No," he said. "Well, they were buried when you took control of the transition." Another director raised his voice. "Victoria, is this true?" She didn't answer. Slide 7. Financial audit. Estimated unfulfilled equity, $32 million. Possible restitution, interest adjusted, over $90 million. "Beyond the money," Richard said, "we stole futures. These women believed in this company. They weren't asking for charity. They were promised a share of what they built. My father may have started this company, but she—" He nodded toward the screen where Elaine's signature glowed. She held up her end. "We didn't." Silence. Then a voice from the far end of the table. And what do you propose we do, Mr. Coleman? Richard took a breath. I want to vote to remove Victoria Reynolds from the board, effective immediately, pending legal inquiry. And I propose we begin a voluntary reparations program for every eligible worker and their descendants. Whispers broke out. Victoria stood. You're gambling with legacy shares, with public perception. Richard cut her off. You gambled with human dignity. A director cleared his throat. Seconded. The vote proceeded. One by one, names were called. 7 votes for removal. 2 abstained. 1 against. Victoria didn't wait for the result to be announced. She walked out, spine straight, expression unreadable. She passed Richard without a glance. When the door clicked shut, Richard exhaled for the first time in an hour. Another director spoke. You realize, Richard, this sets precedent, not just for our company, but for how legacy institutions might have to reckon with their pasts. I know, he said. And you're sure this is the hill you want to stand on? He looked down at the folder in his hands. Then he looked up. I think I was born on this hill. I just didn't know it until now. That night, Zoe waited for him on the balcony. Did it work? She asked. He nodded. Will she go to jail? That's up to the law, but she's out. That's what matters first. Zoe didn't smile. She looked up at the sky, where the clouds had finally broken into stars. My mama's gonna wake up soon, she said softly. And when she does, I want to tell her the story right. What story? She turned to him. The one where the man who owned the house finally came home. He swallowed. There was something sharp behind his ribs, a kind of ache he hadn't known he could feel. I need to tell you something, he said. She tilted her head. Okay. He sat beside her. A long time ago, I met your mother. I didn't know it until recently, but we were close. She didn't tell me she was pregnant. I didn't know. Zoe was quiet for a long time. Then, you're saying you're my father? He nodded once. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat beside him, her legs swinging gently over the edge. After a while, she said, Then I guess I'm not just fixing history. I'm part of it. Elaine Williams opened her eyes 3 weeks later in a white room that smelled faintly of oranges and rubbing alcohol. Zoe was there first. She didn't cry. She just held her mother's hand and said, You're home. Elaine whispered back, Told you I don't break easy. Richard visited that evening. Elaine looked at him with a gaze that didn't flinch. I remember you, she said. He nodded. It took me too long to remember you. She turned to Zoe. He's your father? Zoe said nothing, just nodded once. Elaine took a breath, long and slow. I knew, but I didn't want her to grow up waiting for someone who might never come back. Richard didn't argue. He couldn't. Elaine turned her head toward the window. So what now? He looked at both of them. Now, we start telling the story ourselves. 2 months later, the logo on the downtown skyscraper changed. Coleman and Williams Holdings. The rebranding wasn't just symbolic. 40% of the company's stock was redirected into a restitution fund. Audited, public, and irrevocable. Every former employee of the uniform plant, who had once held an equity letter, now had an account being credited. Some posthumously, their families notified by hand-delivered letters. Some investors were furious. Others surprised the board by applauding. The media storm came and went. For a few weeks, Richard's face appeared on news panels, op-eds, and front pages. Some called it damage control. Others called it legacy saving. But he didn't care. He had a different kind of work to do. The old uniform factory, abandoned since the early 2000s, was purchased quietly through a community trust. Within 6 months, construction crews moved in. Brick by brick, the machines were cleared out, classrooms were added, skylights installed. The building was reborn as the Elaine Williams School of Applied Design, dedicated to girls from under-resourced communities with interest in fashion, textiles, and small-scale manufacturing. Zoe taught the first workshop. 12 years old, confident, unflinching. She wore a jacket she had sewn herself, with words embroidered on the inside cuff. Hands can heal or build. I choose both. The students listened to her like she was already grown. She showed them how to load a bobbin, how to thread a needle in low light, how to patch a hole without anyone ever knowing it was there. Elaine sat in the front row that day. She clapped the loudest. At the reopening ceremony, Richard stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. He wasn't listed as a speaker. He didn't want to be. But a reporter found him anyway. "Mr. Coleman," she asked, "do you consider this redemption?" He thought about that. "No," he said finally. "Redemption is a word for stories where everything gets erased. Nothing got erased here. Some things got mended." The reporter wrote that down. Then Richard added, "The wealth I built before was square footage. Square feet don't hug you. They don't call you dad." That night, back in the penthouse, Zoe brought him a small gift, a square of denim stitched with a simple message in bright red thread. "Thank you for coming back." He framed it above his desk, not as an award, as a reminder. 3 years later, the Restitution Fund had distributed over $57 million. Dozens of families who'd once lived paycheck to paycheck now had scholarships, seed money, and home ownership opportunities. The company saw its most stable growth in over a decade. Zoe's school now offered a 2-year certification in industrial design. Students had gone on to win regional competitions. Some started their own boutiques. Elaine launched a school uniform line made entirely from recycled material. She called it Threaded Roots. Richard no longer sat on 5 corporate boards. Just one. His own. Most mornings, he walked Zoe to school. Not because she needed him to, but because he wanted to be the man she remembered waving from the 5th-floor window, and the one waiting outside when class was done. When asked how it all changed, he always gave the same answer. A girl with bandaged fingers opened the door. I walked in, thinking I owned the building. Turns out I didn't even own myself. Not yet.